I want you to picture something with me. You're lying in a hospital bed. Your body has just done the most extraordinary, brutal, miraculous thing it will ever do. You're holding your newborn daughter for the first time. She's warm, she smells like something you don't have a word for yet, and she's making this tiny sound, somewhere between a cry and a question, like she's already asking you, is this world safe? And you look up at the door, because her father should be walking through it right now. He said he was just stepping out, 15 minutes max. He kissed your forehead, he called you a warrior. But he isn't coming back through that door. Not for hours. And when he does, when he finally walks in, smelling faintly of something that isn't the hospital cafeteria, phone screen hastily turned face down in his jacket pocket, you don't know yet what you've lost. You don't know what he did while you were bleeding and pushing and screaming his name into the ceiling of room 14. You don't find that out until 8 months later. You find that out from his boss's wife, over coffee, on a Tuesday. My name is Mara. I am 34 years old. I live in a small apartment now with my daughter, Lily, who is 2, and a cat named Biscuit, who she loves more than she will ever love me, and I'm okay with that. I'm more than okay. This is the story of how my marriage ended, why it needed to, and what happened when the universe decided it had seen enough. Stay with me. This one is long. It is worth it. I promise you that. I met Daniel at a work conference in Edinburgh. I was 28, he was 31. I worked in marketing for a mid-sized pharmaceutical company. He was in sales for a tech firm. The kind of man who wore a good suit the way some men wear confidence, like it was tailored specifically to make you trust him before he'd said a single interesting thing. He said plenty of interesting things. That was the problem. Daniel was funny, sharp, quick, attentive in a way that felt rare, like he was actually listening, not just waiting for his turn to speak. On our second date, he remembered the name of my childhood dog, which I had mentioned once, briefly in passing, and he asked about her like she was still alive. That's the kind of detail that gets you. That's the kind of detail you file away in the back of your brain under, this one is different. We moved in together after 14 months, engaged at 2 years, married at 3 in a converted barn in Northumberland with fairy lights and my mother in a lavender dress weeping into a handkerchief at the front row. My mother adored Daniel. Everyone adored Daniel. He was a person's person, my aunt said, which I always thought was a strange phrase, but I understood what she meant. He walked into rooms and rooms became warmer. The first 3 years of marriage were, I need to be careful with this word, good. They were genuinely good. We bought a house in Cheshire, not flashy, but ours, a Victorian terrace with a bright blue front door that I picked and Daniel pretended to hate, but secretly loved, I think. We went on proper holidays, Portugal, Tenerife, a budget city break in Prague that we'll both probably remember forever. We had inside jokes, we had a rhythm, and then I got pregnant. We had been trying for 7 months, which felt agonizing at the time, but is nothing really in the grand scheme of things. When the test came back positive, I sat on the edge of the bathtub for a full 5 minutes before I called him in. He cried. I took a photo of him crying and he never knew I had it. It is still my phone's wallpaper. I haven't changed it because it reminds me that something somewhere in there was real, or at least something that looked like real. The pregnancy was hard on me physically. Brutal morning sickness until week 18, a scare at 22 weeks that had us both in the hospital at 2 in the morning, and a symphysis pubis dysfunction diagnosis at 30 weeks that meant I could barely walk without a support belt and a grimace. I was exhausted. I was emotional. I was enormous. And Daniel was fine. He was present in the way a good actor is present, bringing me tea, coming to midwife appointments, rubbing my feet on Thursday evenings while we watch television, which sounds romantic until I tell you that his phone, during those evenings, had started buzzing with a frequency that seemed to have its own rhythm, a pulse. I noticed it. I didn't want to notice it. I told myself I was hormonal. I told myself he worked late because we needed the money. I told myself the distance I felt between us was just the gravity of new life, the weight of what was coming, the fact that everything was about to change. I was half right. Everything was about to change, just not in the way I thought. The woman's name was Justine. I know that now. At the time, she was just a pulse on his phone and a sick feeling in the back of my throat that I swallowed every single night. Justine was 26. She worked at the fitness club Daniel had joined in January, supposedly for health reasons, specifically cited as getting fit before the baby comes. He went 4 mornings a week. He came home glowing. I thought it was the exercise. I am not a stupid woman. I want to be very clear about that. I have a postgraduate degree. I can read rooms. I have good instincts. But pregnancy does something to you. Not to your intelligence, but to your willingness to act on what you know. You are building something inside your body, and the survival of that building project feels more important than the terrifying answer to the question you could ask but are too afraid to hear. So I didn't ask, and he didn't tell, and our daughter came into the world on the 15th of October in room 14 of Withenshaw Hospital at 6:47 in the morning, while her father walked out to get coffee and spent 2.5 hours sending messages to a woman at a gym. I found out 8 months later, on a Tuesday, over coffee, from his boss's wife. The first 8 months of Lily's life were, and I say this with full honesty, the most beautiful and the most lonely of my life, running parallel like 2 train tracks that never touched. Lily was extraordinary. She looked like Daniel around the eyes, but like my grandmother in every other way, which felt like a gift from somewhere. She slept terribly, fed beautifully, and had an opinion about everything from month 3 onward. She was the best thing. She remains the best thing. Daniel was distracted, present in the minimum required way. He changed jobs 3 months before the birth, moved to a larger firm, longer hours, better pay, which at least gave us financial stability. And I told myself the distance between us was stress, adjustment, the chaos of new parenthood. We weren't sleeping. Neither of us was. We weren't romantic. We barely touched. We argued about laundry and feeding schedules and whose turn it was to do the 3 a.m. wake up in a way that felt more like 2 strangers sharing logistical responsibilities than 2 people who had once danced in a barn surrounded by fairy lights. I want to be honest with you. I was not a perfect wife during this time. I was exhausted and tearful, and I cried in the shower more than I've ever admitted to anyone. I wasn't the warm, funny version of myself that Daniel had married, but I was a woman who had gone through a physically grueling pregnancy, a long labor, and was now running on 4-hour sleep stretches, keeping another human being alive. I needed him. I needed him to show up. He was showing up somewhere else. The Tuesday it all cracked open started with absolutely no ceremony whatsoever. I had a rare free morning. My mother had taken Lily for the day, and I was sitting in a Costa in town, treating myself to a proper sit-down coffee and a slice of lemon cake, which felt genuinely luxurious at the time, which tells you everything about what my life had become. That was when Caroline sat down across from me. I want to describe Caroline to you properly because she matters. She was in her mid-50s, immaculately dressed, the kind of woman who seems like she's survived things but chosen to be elegant about it. She was married to Richard, who was Daniel's boss at the new firm. I had met her once, briefly, at the company Christmas party, where we'd had a 20-minute conversation about gardens and then gone our separate ways. I had absolutely no reason to expect what was about to come out of her mouth. She sat down, wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, looked at me with an expression I can only describe as deliberately calm, and said, "Mara, I debated this for 3 months, but if I were you, I would want to know." My lemon cake sat untouched for the next 45 minutes. What Caroline knew, she knew because her husband had made the catastrophic error of complaining about it at home. Apparently, it had become a problem at work. Daniel and Justine, who had stopped being a gym instructor and become, in the intervening months, a sales support coordinator at the same firm Daniel had moved to, which was either coincidence or design, and I'll let you decide which, had been carrying on openly enough that colleagues were uncomfortable. Someone had filed an informal complaint. Richard had pulled Daniel into his office in September and told him to end it quietly, or it would become a formal HR matter. Daniel had presumably ended it, or at least moved it underground because nothing formal had proceeded. But Caroline had heard all of this, and then she had looked at me at the Christmas party, holding my 8-week-old baby in a carrier, dark circles under my eyes, laughing too hard at someone's joke the way you do when you're desperate to feel normal, and she had thought about it for 3 months, whether to say something, whether it was her place. She decided it was. "The reason I'm telling you," she said, "isn't just the affair. And here is where I need you to stay with me, because this is where it goes from devastating to something else entirely." Richard told me something else. About 3 weeks after your daughter was born, Daniel asked him for emergency financial advice. He wanted to know the fastest way to move personal assets without a joint account holder being able to trace it easily. I put my coffee cup down. Richard thought it was odd, but gave him some general information, standard stuff. He didn't know at the time about the girlfriend. I heard the words she was saying. I heard them in the correct order, but my brain was doing that strange thing where information arrives before your body knows what to do with it, like the gap between lightning and thunder. "How much?" I heard myself say. Caroline reached into her handbag and placed a folded piece of paper on the table between us. I don't know how she had it. I didn't ask. I unfolded it. The number on the paper was £47,000. Our joint savings, the account we'd been building for 3 years, the one we'd earmarked for home renovations and Lily's future and a proper family holiday somewhere with a pool. Moved in 3 separate transactions beginning 4 days after Lily was born to an account I had no access to and until 45 seconds ago no knowledge of. He had sat next to me in that hospital bed. He had held our daughter. He had cried, and he had been planning this. I drove home on autopilot. I put the folded piece of paper on the kitchen table. I stood in the doorway of Lily's empty room, my mother still had her, and I looked at the little white cot and the mobile with the small felt stars, and I felt something happen inside me that I'm going to try to describe accurately. It wasn't grief. I'd been grieving for months without knowing it. It wasn't rage exactly, though that came later, hot and clear and incredibly useful. It was something more like clarity, like a room where someone had finally turned on the lights. I knew in that moment with absolute certainty 3 things. 1, I was done. 2, he was not going to get away with what he had done. And 3, I needed a very good lawyer, a very good accountant, and approximately 48 hours before Daniel came home from work to begin making both of those calls. I was done crying. I was done waiting. I was done being the woman who didn't ask because she was too afraid of the answer. I asked, I got my answers, and then I got to work. I need to be clear with you about something. The revenge I'm about to describe is not cinematic. It is not a grand confrontation in a restaurant. There is no single moment where I throw a glass of wine or deliver a speech that makes everyone in the room applaud. Real revenge, the kind that actually works, is paperwork. It is phone calls made in hushed voices while your baby naps. It is a solicitor's office in a business park that smells like printer ink and slightly stale biscuits. It is a forensic accountant named Patricia who wears reading glasses on a beaded chain and looks at your husband's financial records the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray, clinically, precisely, with a faint expression that tells you she has seen this before and she is not even slightly surprised. I found Patricia through my solicitor. I found my solicitor through a women's legal advice service I'd Googled in the bathroom at 11 at night, sitting on the cold tile floor with Lily asleep in the next room, and my husband downstairs watching television, completely unaware that his wife had just become his problem. Patricia found the 47,000 pounds within a week. She also found something else, a secondary account, smaller, messier, less carefully hidden, that he had apparently opened for day-to-day expenses that I also knew nothing about. Approximately 11,000 pounds had flowed through it over 18 months. What was it spent on? Weekends I hadn't been invited to, restaurants I'd never been to, a set of luggage I never saw packed or unpacked in our hallway. The total figure my solicitor included in the divorce petition was just shy of 62,000 pounds in undisclosed marital assets. I said nothing to Daniel, not for 2 weeks. I went about my life, bathing Lily, making dinner, lying next to him in bed and staring at the ceiling while he slept, and I was almost impressed by myself. I had never known I had that kind of stillness in me, that kind of patience. Turns out, betrayal either breaks you or it calcifies something previously soft. Mine calcified. I served him the divorce papers on a Thursday morning, just after he'd had his first coffee, but before he'd left for work. I wanted him alert. I wanted him to read every word. He stared at the envelope for a long time. Then he looked at me, and I watched. I watched the exact moment he calculated whether he could talk his way out of this, whether there was a version of this story where he was the reasonable one, whether I knew enough. "I can explain," he started. The number on page 4 is the total of what Patricia found. Patricia is a forensic accountant. Page 7 is the secondary account. Page 12 is the statement from your colleague about the relationship with Justine. Would you like to keep explaining, or would you like to call your lawyer? He called his lawyer. The divorce took 11 months. I will not pretend it was easy. It was expensive and exhausting, and there were days, many of them, when I drove home from a mediation session and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. But here's what the law did for me, clearly and completely. Under the matrimonial assets framework, the concealed money was treated as dissipated assets, money he deliberately removed from the marital pot, which the court factored back in when calculating the settlement. I was awarded a significantly higher share of the house equity to account for this. I also received a settlement that gave me a clean start. Not lavish, not enough to make me forget any of it, but enough. Daniel did not end up with Justine. I want to tell you that for exactly one reason, which is not that I'm happy about his pain, but because of what happened. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, the HR complaint at his firm, which had apparently never been fully resolved, just shelved, was formally reopened following a second complaint from a different female employee. Daniel was let go, quietly but definitively. He is currently, from what I understand, renting a flat somewhere in Salford and doing contract sales work. I am not gloating, I genuinely am not, but I want to be honest. When I found out, I made myself a cup of tea, sat at my kitchen table, watched Lily arrange her toy animals into what she explained was a meeting, and I felt for the first time in 2 years something close to settled. The universe does not always correct things. I want to be real with you about that. I've seen situations where it never does, where bad people coast and good people get tired. But sometimes, the thing a person has built their life on, the charm, the easy exits, the practiced smile, becomes the exact thing that takes them down. Daniel had built a life on being the person everyone trusted before he'd said a single interesting thing. And eventually, people stopped trusting him. That is justice. Imperfect, slow, unglamorous, deeply satisfying justice. Lily is 2 now. She has strong opinions about crackers and deeply suspicious feelings about hats. And she wakes up every morning like the day is an event she has been personally invited to. I watch her sometimes and I think, she will never know the version of me who stayed in the bathroom crying. She will only ever know the version who made the calls, who found Patricia, who sat across from a solicitor in a business park smelling of biscuits and said, "Tell me exactly what I'm entitled to." I want to say something to you, whoever you are, wherever you are watching this. Maybe you're folding laundry, maybe you're on your lunch break, maybe you're lying in bed at night with that quiet, persistent feeling in your stomach that something isn't adding up. Trust that feeling, not to blow your life up, not to act before you know, but to pay attention, to start quietly gathering your own clarity, to remember that knowing is always better than not knowing, even when knowing is devastating, because you cannot build anything real on a foundation you're too afraid to look at. I am not a revenge story. I am a woman who finally started paying attention. The rest wrote itself. If any part of this resonated with you, if you've lived something like this or know someone who has, leave it in the comments. I read every single one. Your story matters. You are not alone in this. And if you're new here, subscribe. There's more where this came from. Mara.